When we talk about manipulation, we're not just talking about persuasion or influence. We're talking about a very specific kind of psychological strategy. Psychological manipulation is a form of social influence that aims to shape the thoughts, feelings, or behaviors of another person through underhanded, deceptive, or even abusive tactics. It's not about helping someone grow or guiding them toward a healthier choice. It's about control. The manipulator wants to bend reality, not in your favor, but in theirs. Now, it's important to make a clear distinction right from the beginning. Influence is not the same thing as manipulation. Healthy influence is honest, transparent, and respectful. For example, a teacher influences a student by showing them the benefits of learning. A coach influences a team by guiding them with encouragement and constructive feedback. In these situations, the other person always has the freedom to say no. Manipulation, on the other hand, removes that freedom. It thrives on coercion, pressure, and deceit. Instead of respecting boundaries, manipulators push past them. Instead of accepting no, they turn no into guilt, confusion, or obligation until it becomes a reluctant yes. Influence is mutual. It helps both sides. Manipulation is one-sided. It benefits the manipulator at the expense of the person being targeted. At the heart of all manipulation lies a single driving force: power and control. The manipulator isn't just trying to win an argument or persuade you on one small point. Their deeper goal is to control how you think, how you feel, and even how you act. It's about shaping your decisions to serve their needs, often leaving you drained, uncertain, or dependent in the process. And here where it gets tricky. Manipulation doesn't always look extreme or obvious. It exists on a spectrum. On one end, you might see subtle, everyday tactics, things like guilt trips or passive-aggressive comments, sometimes done unconsciously. On the far end of the spectrum, you find highly calculated, destructive patterns of behavior, often tied to deeper psychological issues. In fact, research has shown that chronic manipulation is a hallmark of certain personality disorders, such as narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder. So when we explore the mind of a manipulator, we need to keep this spectrum in mind. Not every manipulator is a criminal mastermind, but all of them share the same core objective: to gain control by distorting reality in their favor. If we really want to understand how manipulators control others, we need to look at what's happening inside their minds. Now, this doesn't mean we're justifying or excusing their behavior. Manipulation is harmful, no matter the reason behind it. But by exploring their psychology, we can start to see the patterns more clearly, and that knowledge becomes power. At the core of many manipulators is a deep sense of insecurity. On the surface, they might appear confident, even dominant, but beneath that mask, there's often a fragile ego. They crave control because internally they feel powerless. By making others feel small, confused, or dependent, they temporarily soothe their own fear of being insignificant or unworthy. In this way, manipulation becomes their defense against the vulnerability they cannot handle. Another defining trait is a lack of empathy. Many studies in psychology have highlighted that individuals with narcissistic or antisocial traits often show impairments in emotional empathy. They may understand emotions intellectually. They know what sadness looks like or what anger feels like in theory, but they don't connect with it on a human level. That means when you're hurting, they don't actually feel your pain. To them, your emotions are just tools, levers they can pull to get the response they want. Then there's entitlement. Manipulators often believe that their needs outweigh everyone else. If they want attention, you should give it. If they want loyalty, you owe it. And when you resist, they see it as an injustice against them rather than a reasonable boundary. This sense of entitlement justifies, in their mind, the use of deception or coercion to get what they believe they deserve. Also see a pattern of emotional immaturity. Manipulators are often unable or unwilling to manage their emotions in a healthy way. Feelings like envy, shame, or anger become overwhelming. Instead of processing them, they project them onto others. For example, rather than admit they feel insecure, they accuse you of being insecure. Instead of owning their anger, they use passive aggression or guilt tripping to dump it on you. Manipulation becomes a way to offload emotions they can't handle internally. It's also important to mention that manipulation can be a learned behavior. Many manipulators grew up in dysfunctional family systems where control, guilt, or emotional blackmail were normal. As children, they may have discovered that lying, flattering, or creating conflict gave them attention or helped them avoid punishment. Over time, these tactics solidified into their main way of relating to others. So when you put all of this together, insecurity, lack of empathy, entitlement, immaturity, and learned survival tactics, you get a clear picture of the manipulator's mindset. It's not a mindset built on trust, respect, or collaboration. It's a mindset built on control, self-preservation, and the exploitation of others. And the more we understand this psychological profile, the easier it becomes to spot manipulation early, before it takes root. Now that we understand the inner psychology of manipulators, let's look at the actual tools they use to gain control. These tactics are not random. They're deliberate strategies designed to confuse, weaken, and dominate the other person. And the more familiar you are with them, the harder it becomes for a manipulator to use them on you. One of the most infamous tactics is gaslighting. This is when the manipulator tries to make you doubt your own memory, perception, or even your sanity. For example, you might clearly remember them saying something hurtful, but they'll insist, "I never said that, you're imagining things." Over time, this constant denial chips away at your confidence. The term itself comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband manipulates his wife into questioning her reality. Modern psychology recognizes gaslighting as one of the most destructive forms of psychological abuse, because once you stop trusting your own mind, the manipulator can rewrite reality for you. Another common tactic is guilt tripping. This is when the manipulator twists situations to make you feel responsible for their unhappiness. Maybe you set a healthy boundary, and suddenly they act as though you've betrayed them. Or they say things like, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me." The goal is to make you feel so guilty that you abandon your own needs just to ease their disappointment. Then we have love bombing and devaluation. Love bombing is when the manipulator showers you with affection, praise, and attention at the beginning. They overwhelm you with admiration and make you feel like you've finally found someone who truly sees you. But once they've built your trust and created dependency, the devaluation phase begins. They pull back, criticize you, or become cold and distant. This creates confusion and a painful craving for the good version of them to return. Research has shown that this cycle of idealization and devaluation can actually trigger addictive responses in the brain, much like gambling or substance use. Another weapon in their arsenal is passive aggression. Instead of expressing anger directly, they let it seep out through sarcasm, subtle insults, procrastination, or the silent treatment. For example, they may say something like, "Wow, must be nice to have so much free time," when what they really mean is they're resentful of your choices. Passive aggression allows them to deny hostility if confronted, while still making you feel guilty, uneasy, or defensive. What makes these tactics so powerful is that they often operate beneath the surface. You may sense something feels off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. That's why numbing them is so important. Once you can say, "This is gaslighting," or "This is guilt tripping," you take back the clarity the manipulator is trying to steal. We've already looked at gaslighting, guilt tripping, love bombing, and passive aggression, but those are only part of the manipulator's toolkit. Let's go deeper into some of the other strategies they use to keep control. One of the most common is projection. This is when the manipulator accuses you of the very thing they are doing. For instance, a liar might constantly accuse you of dishonesty. A person who cheats might suddenly become obsessed with your loyalty. By projecting their flaws onto you, they deflect attention away from themselves and put you on the defensive. Psychologists describe projection as a defense mechanism. It allows them to avoid facing their own shortcomings by unloading them onto someone else. Another tactic is isolation. Manipulators know that as long as you have access to friends, family, or coworkers who see things clearly, you'll have perspective. So they slowly and systematically try to cut you off from those support systems. Maybe they criticize your loved ones, discourage you from spending time with them, or create conflicts that make you withdraw. The more isolated you become, the more dependent you are on the manipulator for validation and reality checks. Research in coercive control has shown that isolation is one of the strongest predictors of long-term entrapment in abusive dynamics. Then there's moving the goalposts. This is when you finally meet their demand or achieve what they claimed they wanted, only for them to shift the standard. Let's say you complete a project exactly as they asked, and instead of acknowledging it, they say, "Well, that's fine, but it's not really enough." This ensures you're always chasing approval that never comes. The manipulator stays in control by keeping you in a perpetual state of inadequacy. Another powerful strategy is triangulation. This is when the manipulator brings in a third person to control the dynamic. They might compare you to an ex-partner, a sibling, or even a coworker, saying things like, "Why can't you be more like them?" Sometimes they'll use this third party as a messenger, relaying things through someone else to create confusion. The point of triangulation is to destabilize you, create competition, and keep you fighting for the manipulator's approval. What all these tactics have in common is that they create instability. When you're constantly defending yourself against projection, cut off from support, striving for an ever-changing goal, or competing with a third party, your focus shifts away from your own needs. Instead, it gets locked onto the manipulator. And that's exactly where they want it. Up to this point, we've been looking at individual tactics. Gaslighting, guilt tripping, projection, each of them can do real damage. But when you put them all together, something bigger begins to emerge. Manipulation isn't just about isolated incidents. It often becomes a pattern of coercive control. Coercive control is a strategy designed to entrap someone, not just influence them. It's about systematically stripping away a person's autonomy until their sense of freedom, safety, and even identity begins to erode. Researchers like Dr. Evan Stark have described coercive control as being less about single acts of abuse and more about the ongoing structure of domination. It's a slow, invisible cage built through repeated psychological tactics. One of the most powerful tools within this cage is what therapist Dr. Susan Forward called emotional blackmail. She used the acronym FOG, fear, obligation, and guilt, to explain how manipulators corner their targets. Fear of losing the relationship, obligation to meet the manipulator's endless demands, guilt for not being good enough. If you've ever found yourself agreeing to something just to avoid an explosion, or staying silent because speaking up feels like a betrayal, you've probably felt the weight of fog. Here, how it works in practice. Manipulators identify what you value most, your reputation, your relationships, your job, your children, and then they make that thing feel like it's at risk. Sometimes the threat is explicit. If you leave me, I'll ruin you. Other times it's subtle. If you really love me, you'd do this. Either way, the message is clear: comply or risk losing what matters most. And to make matters worse, manipulators often use intermittent reinforcement. That means they'll sprinkle in moments of kindness, affection, or generosity between episodes of control. Maybe after days of coldness or criticism, suddenly they're sweet, attentive, and loving again. This unpredictable cycle is incredibly addictive. Psychologists have compared it to a slot machine. Because the reward is random, the brain clings to hope, always waiting for the good version of the manipulator to return. That's why coercive control and emotional blackmail are so devastating. They don't just change how you act in one moment, they rewire the way you think and feel over time. The manipulator doesn't need chains or locks. They create a prison out of fear, obligation, guilt, and hope. So far, we've looked at manipulation from the perspective of behavior and tactics, but psychology gives us an even deeper lens. Researchers have studied these patterns for decades, and their findings help explain why manipulators are so effective at gaining control. One of the key voices in this field is Dr. George Simon, a clinical psychologist who has written extensively about what he calls covert aggression. Unlike open aggression, which is easy to spot, covert aggression is subtle, hidden, and disguised as something else. A manipulator might act like they're just asking questions, or joking, or misunderstood, but underneath, their true goal is domination. Simon refers to many manipulators as character disturbed, meaning they don't struggle with guilt or conscience in the same way most people do. That lack of internal brakes allows them to use tactics the rest of us would find unthinkable. Another important concept is cognitive dissonance, a term coined by psychologist Leon Festinger. Cognitive dissonance describes the discomfort we feel when our beliefs and experiences don't line up. For example, if someone tells you, "I love you," but repeatedly hurts you, your mind scrambles to make sense of it. Do you accept the painful truth, or do you twist your thinking to protect the relationship? Many people choose the second option. They rationalize, minimize, or excuse the manipulator's behavior. Manipulators thrive on this dissonance because the more confused you are, the easier it is to control you. Then there's trauma bonding, a concept that explains why victims often feel intensely attached to their abuser. This bond forms through a cycle of abuse and reward. The tension, the fear, the occasional kindness, it all activates powerful stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, mixed with the brain's reward chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin. The result is a physiological attachment that can feel just as strong, if not stronger, than healthy love. Research has shown that trauma bonds can mimic addiction, which is why people often return to manipulative relationships even after leaving. We also need to talk about empathy research. Studies, such as those by neuroscientist Alexandra Jankovic and colleagues, have shown that people with narcissistic traits may have intact cognitive empathy, meaning they can understand what someone else is feeling, but impaired emotional empathy. They can recognize your sadness, but don't actually feel it with you. That makes them highly skilled at identifying vulnerabilities without being weighed down by compassion. It's like knowing exactly where the bruise is, but pressing on it anyway. When you put all of this science together, covert aggression, cognitive dissonance, trauma bonding, and empathy deficits, it becomes clear why manipulation is so effective. It's not just a battle of words or emotions. It's a psychological process that targets the way our brains are wired. At this point, you might be wondering, why does this even work? Why do smart, capable, even strong-willed people fall into manipulative dynamics? The truth is, manipulation doesn't just prey on weakness. It exploits normal human needs and psychological blind spots. One of the biggest vulnerabilities is empathy. People who are kind-hearted, who want to see the good in others, are often the easiest targets. Manipulators sense this. They know if they act wounded, you'll feel responsible for helping them. If they hint at abandonment, you'll reassure them. Your empathy becomes the lever they pull to gain control. Another vulnerability is people-pleasing. Some individuals, often because of their upbringing, are wired to avoid conflict and seek approval. If you grew up in an environment where love had to be earned through compliance, manipulation can feel eerily familiar. Even though it's painful, it's also what your nervous system recognizes as normal. Psychologists sometimes call this repetition compulsion. We unconsciously repeat patterns from childhood because they feel familiar, even if they're harmful. Then there's the sunk cost fallacy, a concept from behavioral economics that applies perfectly here. The more time, effort, or emotion you invest in someone, the harder it becomes to walk away, even when it's clear the relationship is toxic. You think, I've already given so much, if I leave now, it's all wasted. Manipulators know this. They drag things out, making sure you're so invested that leaving feels like tearing away part of yourself. Manipulators also exploit basic human needs, the need to belong, to be loved, to be understood. At first, they often present themselves as the answer to those needs. They shower you with attention, they listen intently, they make you feel special. And once you're hooked, they start to withdraw those things, forcing you to chase after them. That push and pull dynamic creates dependency. Over time, these tactics lead to something even more damaging, the erosion of self-trust. When you're constantly gaslit, criticized, or compared to others, you begin to question your own judgment. You second-guess your memory, your instincts, even your worth. And once you no longer trust yourself, you lean more heavily on the manipulator's version of reality. That's how control becomes complete, not by brute force, but by slowly breaking down the victim's confidence in their own mind. This is why manipulation works, not because the target is weak, but because the manipulator is skilled at weaponizing normal human traits, kindness, loyalty, hope, against the very people who hold them. We've seen how manipulation works and why it's effective. But what does it actually do to the person on the receiving end? The effects of prolonged manipulation are not just temporary discomfort. They can leave lasting marks on the mind, the emotions, and even the body. Let's start with the cognitive impacts. Victims often describe feeling like they're losing their mind. Constant gaslighting and shifting narratives create chronic self-doubt. Decision-making becomes difficult because you no longer trust your own judgment. Confusion, brain fog, and mental exhaustion are common. You might even find yourself questioning basic memories or perceptions, wondering, am I overreacting, or is this really happening? Then there are the emotional impacts. Anxiety and depression are extremely common in people who have been manipulated, living in a constant state of tension, never knowing when the next guilt trip, silent treatment, or explosion will come, keeps the nervous system on high alert. Over time, this can lead to what psychologists call complex PTSD or CPTSD, a condition often seen in survivors of ongoing relational trauma. Emotional numbness can also develop, as the mind shuts down feelings to protect itself from being overwhelmed. Manipulation also affects behavior. Victims often withdraw socially, not because they don't want connection, but because they feel ashamed, isolated, or too drained to engage. Hypervigilance becomes another survival mechanism. You start scanning for subtle mood changes in others, always bracing for conflict. Over time, you may lose interest in hobbies, passions, or goals that once defined you, because so much energy has been spent surviving the manipulative dynamic. And we can't ignore the physical impacts. Prolonged psychological stress doesn't just live in the mind, it takes a toll on the body. The book The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk explains how trauma imprints itself physically, often showing up as chronic fatigue, headaches, gastrointestinal issues, or a weakened immune system. Stress hormones like cortisol, when activated over long periods of time, can disrupt sleep, digestion, and even cardiovascular health. The body begins to carry the burden of the manipulation, sometimes long after the relationship has ended. So when we talk about manipulation, we're not just describing a set of clever tricks. We're talking about something that can alter the way a person thinks, feels, acts, and even how their body functions. Recognizing these impacts is crucial, not to scare people, but to validate the experiences of survivors and highlight the seriousness of manipulative behavior. Up until now, we've focused on how manipulators think, the tactics they use, and the impact they leave behind. But knowledge is only half the battle. The real question is, how do you break free from this cycle of control? The first steps are about clarity, boundaries, and reclaiming your reality. The most powerful tool you have is simply numbing the behavior. When you can clearly identify what's happening, this is gaslighting, or this is guilt tripping, you take back psychological ground. Instead of spinning in confusion, you begin to see the pattern for what it is. That moment of recognition creates distance between you and the manipulator's tactics. It's like turning on the lights in a dark room. Suddenly, you can see where the traps are. Another important step is reestablishing reality. Manipulators thrive by distorting your perception, so grounding yourself in truth becomes essential. Simple practices like journaling can be powerful, writing down what was said, how you felt, and what actually happened. When doubts creep in later, you have evidence of your own reality. Confiding in a safe third party, like a trusted friend or therapist, can also counteract isolation. Just having someone validate your experience can undo a lot of the confusion created by gaslighting. There's also a principle known as JADE: don't justify, argue, defend, or explain. When you fall into explaining yourself to a manipulator, you give them more material to twist and use against you. Instead, learn to set boundaries without over-explaining. For example, instead of saying, "I can't come because I'm too tired and I've had a long week," you simply say, "No, I won't be coming." Boundaries don't require justification. Another mindset shift is to stop focusing on the manipulator's intent and start focusing on their impact. Manipulators often deflect responsibility by saying things like, "I didn't mean it that way," or "You're too sensitive." But the reality is this: if the behavior is hurtful, it's unacceptable, regardless of intent. Shifting the focus to impact places the power back in your hands, because you no longer need to decode their motives to decide what is or isn't okay for you. Breaking the cycle isn't about winning arguments with manipulators or getting them to admit they're wrong. It's about reclaiming your clarity, your boundaries, and your self-trust. And those internal shifts are the foundation for real freedom.